a 5-committee meeting, 2 from the Senate, Agriculture and Natural Resources and Energy, and 3 from the House, Natural Resources and Energy, Agriculture and Forest Products, and Fish, Wildlife, and Water Resources. We're gathered here today to hear our Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation deliver the first public report on forest fragmentation. And we are looking forward to this presentation. Michael, I'm going to get you started right away. And
thank you.
Come on up.
Well, actually, Chairman, if you don't mind, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Trey Martin. I'm the Deputy Secretary at ANR. And, on behalf of Secretary Markowitz, who couldn't be here today, it's a great pleasure to introduce Michael and his team and the really important and excellent work that they've done on this report to you this morning. I know that if the Secretary were here today, she would tell you that this work, the year's worth of work that this team has put into this, is a top priority for the Agency of Natural Resources. It's also a top priority, a top personal priority for Deb to make sure that this work bears fruit and that we move forward and address the really important questions of how to protect our forest health and forest integrity. Right now, I think most of you know, the legislators who are sitting here and probably the people in the audience, that there are a lot of critical priorities that our agency is working on right now. Clean water, clean air, climate, good process improvements to the way that we do business, protecting critical habitats and species ecosystems. There's a lot that we're doing. And among all those priorities, forest health and forest integrity rise to the top. In fact, forest health and forest integrity tie all that work together. They galvanize all that work that we're doing. So I know that if the Secretary were here, she would want to tell you a little bit more before we turn it over to Michael, who's a great expert who's put a lot of time into this. She would want to tell you a little bit more about why forests are such critical environmental assets. Right? I think a lot of people know this, but just to underscore it, the forests are the first bastion that we have in protecting and cleaning our surface waters. They store and sink carbon and clean our air. Forests they provide a critical habitat for countless species. They provide a set of ecosystem services that we can't match in a built landscape. And I know Commissioner Snyder will explain to you more what I mean by ecosystem services, but there's a whole set of things here that forests provide that we're very excited to tell you about this morning, which is not even to mention the forest economy and the millions of dollars that it brings in every year in Vermont, the recreational opportunities that forests provide, and just the chance for restoration and tranquility and to be in the woods and to make yourself whole that we achieve when we go out into our forests. Now, the Commissioner this morning is going to also tell you that how complex and fragile our forest systems are. They're still in recovery from the massive clearing and wood extraction that happened in the 19th century. And as we look forward, as we plan for the future, this report provides a set of options that is going to inform the planning decisions and the planning conversations we have through this next century. We need to stop thinking about forests only as the backdrop of smart growth in Vermont, but move forests forward to be the focus of our choice, or a focus of the choices we make as we look forward and plan for the future of Vermont. Now, the Secretary isn't here today, so I'm just going to finish by telling you a little bit about why this is so important to me. First of all, it's a great honor to work with Michael. His passion, his dedication, his integrity, his enthusiasm they are an inspiration to me as a member of the Agency of Natural Resources. I learn from him every day, and I go home every day being better because he's my colleague. I think we're all better off because Michael's at the Agency of Natural Resources and dedicating his life to this work. But it's not just him personally, it's the team that he's put together and the work that they've done over the last year to bring this report to you this morning. It is great work, and it's really important work. I'm lucky enough to live in Calais, near a pretty nice unfragmented chunk of woods that centers around the Chicory Bog. My family and I go out, we bike and hike and ski in those woods. We take firewood from the woods, we take food from the woods. We find great satisfaction from teaching our children to work those woods and to be out there. Moreover, I go out personally. It's not just about the next generation. For me personally, when I go out in the summertime, if I get out at the right time of day and hear the hermit thrush call, which there's a little window in the evening where there's a nest up near the top of one of our hills, and I can hear that hermit thrush and that ethereal cathedral sound that it makes. It makes me realize how much a part of this deeper and interconnected system that I am. And to bring it back to Mike and his team, it makes me realize just how interconnected everything is and how important it is that we have leaders like Mike who are talking about conservation for the sake of conservation for all those values, not just economic, not just environmental, but the interconnection of people, the built landscape, the natural landscape, and the future of Vermont. So thanks very much for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Snyder now.
Any questions? Try to do a bang-up job sort of summarizing the summary that I'm going to give you here. So for the record, I'm Michael Snyder, Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation, and I'm pleased to be here. I'm happy to see so many faces. And I'm pleased to offer what will be a presentation. It's an overview, a summary of the Forest Fragmentation Report, which contains a lot of details that go well beyond what I'm speaking about here this morning. So in the interest of time, if you're really busy, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'd like to, but I think it is important to give some sense of what's in this report today to get things started. And that's where we'll begin. Before I go too far, I want to acknowledge that this is, I appreciate Deputy Secretary Martin mentioning the team. This has very much been a team effort, certainly from our Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, but with other colleagues in the agency, particularly at the Department, the Fish and Wildlife Department. I want to thank those folks. We've had a kind of a core team. This is actually very strange. I think I might get dizzy by the time I'm done here. I just don't want to turn my back to anybody. It's impossible. Let's see how I can do over here. So we have a core team of folks whose work we worked together on this over several months with lots of other input, and I think it's really important to recognize them, and they are recognized in the report itself. To reset and give a little, why are we here? This didn't fall out of the sky. This is a result of Act 118 from 2014. Last year it was passed into law, an act relating to forest integrity, which I would submit is something of a historic thing. I'm not sure those words, forest integrity, have ever appeared in any legislation. And I think it's telling and it's really important. And that was a very relatively short bill. It had some findings. Let's say Vermont's forests are a unique and valuable resource, establish them as valuable for many things. They are essential to our quality of life and our brand, and that fragmentation is a threat to those values of Vermont's forests. Then further, the bill jumped from findings to a mandate to the Commissioner to report on forest fragmentation, assessing the current and projected effects of fragmentation in Vermont, and making recommendations for how to protect forest integrity. So that's why we're here. And well, these many months later, I'm very happy to be presenting this, again, an overview of that work. I always like to begin on anything like this with, let's start with the forest itself. And just confirm what we mean by forest. This is kind of a forest geeky definition, but I think it says a lot. Forests are, a forest is a biological community dominated by trees, certainly, but so much more than trees. Also consisting of other plants, animals, and microorganisms. And importantly, the associated physical environment, the soils, the geology, the hydrosphere, and their combined interactions and processes. Right? So this is where we say, think more, I think it's very helpful to think of forests more as a verb than a noun. It's about, forests are marked by variation and dynamism. They change whether we're messing with them or not. Okay, so I think it's really helpful to establish that we're talking about forests as a community of trees, associated organisms, their physical environment, and the interactions among all of those elements. That's what defines a forest, and I think it's important to begin there. I'd like to begin by also acknowledging we have a history. I've mentioned this dynamism. Our forests have changed over many, many, many years. And so I'm going to borrow from the Harvard Forest dioramas, these art renderings of generalized patterns of what New England's general forest landscape has looked like in the past. So there was relatively minimal Native American influence on the forests of New England. And when early European settlers arrived, they saw a well-developed, complex, something of an old forest, right, with minimal human impact. Forests that have evolved over millennia, and that's what at European contact, that's what was here. So pre-settlement, 1700 forest, not a forest of just big trees and nothing else. You've heard of maybe this lore of a squirrel climbs a tree in Vermont and can run through their canopy all the way to Missouri. No, there were, owing to storms and natural disturbances, there were breaks in the canopy naturally occurring, and many different age classes of trees. It wasn't just one layer of old trees. Very complex old forest, which is where we began. And then, as will be a theme throughout this presentation, is we have to also consider the role of us, people, on this landscape. And so our Vermont landscape history was marked by people carving out a living from that forest primeval. First, subsistence farming, clearing for building homes and just scratching out a living in a very tough environment, but clearing trees and planting crops and burning a lot of wood for heat. And that continued for about a century, and include somewhere in the middle of the 1800s, Vermont was mostly not forest. It was about 20% forested, 80% cleared, principally for agriculture. And that's where it really began, was this first wave of people interacting with this forest landscape. Somewhere in the middle of that century, people got word, owing to a lot of factors, people started to leave. I'd like to sort of characterize it as they heard about 30 feet of stone-free topsoil in Iowa, and said, I think I'll go there to do my farming. And there were other factors, of course, but there was a large migration away from New England's upland forests, away, and that allowed this farm abandonment, as we've come to call it, allowed that forest to regenerate. This is one of the first examples of the remarkable resilience of forests. We first saw those farm fields being recovered by what we call old field white pine on abandoned farmland towards the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then those pines, they were particularly good at their seeds landing in those disturbed soils, and they grew up. But then the sort of more native hardwoods started to compete with those and recover. Again, remember, the point here is that forests, you could say, are the original native Vermonters, right? And then the rest is the history of people interacting with that forest. And here the forest is returning, vigorously growing hardwoods in the early 1900s, which brings us to today. We are 75% forested. The fourth most forested state in the country, third most in the lower 48. We have about 5% of that landscape is developed, and another 20% in agricultural use. So we are a forested state. And this is the best part, is to say that we are extremely lucky. So we have expansive forests, and they are generally in pretty good shape. There are, however, some unsettling trends in our forests, and that's why we need to start paying attention to this and look at that. So we're saying future changes in this forest land, knowing that change has marked this entire history, will depend on how we interact, this number here, how we continue to build on our history of compact settlements with agricultural land surrounded by a larger forest landscape. That's kind of the ideal. We're doing well with it, and that's, I guess, the basic premise here is that's what we value it, and we want to make sure that we can continue on this course. Need to bring in the people again. So we have this forested landscape, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that forest, but it's really important to understand that Vermont is more than 80%, the forest land in Vermont is more than 80% owned by private, not public, so there's some state land, there's some federal land, There's some municipal lands, but by and large, the 3.5 million acres of forest land in Vermont are owned by mostly families, individuals and families. There's some corporate and industrial ownership, but compared to the rest of the New England states, Vermont is really dominated by family forests. And this is really important as we move forward. So as a summary of our current situation, you can see here we are a forested state. The yellow is the Green Mountain National Forest and a bunch of state forests, state park, wildlife management areas, and some municipal lands. But mostly this green is forest and it is privately owned. So we are forested and heavily privately owned, which we need to look at a little further. What about those owners? We're talking about the percent of Vermont's forest in owners categories of age. Younger owners, middle-aged owners, and starting to look at older owners. And there's the green bars here are the number of owners. And you see we have lots of Vermont's forest land is owned by people in their sort of mid-years, but most of the land area of Vermont is owned by private landowners who are 65 years or older. And this has significant implications for the fate of our land because of what's their fate. This is the idea of intergenerational transfer and estate planning and succession planning, which has significant implications for the integrity of forest land and land use decisions. Again, the key pieces here are lots of increasing numbers of parcels, of more and more landowners. Not any more land, just dividing that land into more ownerships. This is significant. And then considering the demographic, a particular demographic of Vermont's land ownership, the forest land is owned more by folks nearing retirement or into retirement and making decisions about the fate of their land. We'll return to this. Interestingly, so that's the demographics, the land area, the ownership, and the demographics. But why do people own land? And based on woodland owner surveys, repeatedly, we find that the reasons people own land are really on this end. Home, it comes with their home. They're sort of accidental forest landowners. They have a house that came with some forest land. It's not about owning forest land. It's a home, maybe privacy, aesthetics. Some folks refer to wildlife and biodiversity as important. They have a pride in owning some land, knowing that it's home to wildlife. And recreation. These are the predominant reasons we find people own land and forest land in Vermont. When you think about the importance of timber production and other forest products for economic value, it's really significant in Vermont, but people don't ever talk about it. They talk about these other values. This happens, and it's really important, and we'll mention that a little bit more in a few minutes, but it's interesting that that's not what people say they're interested in. It's not what they report to care about or why they own their forest land. I think this is helpful. So we have a forested state, privately owned, changing demographics, and an interesting sense of why people own that land. We also can look at some trends in population and development, the use of that land. And the real take-home here is that the rate of development exceeds the rate of population growth. So we are using land at a rate that outpaces our own population growth. That suggests that we're using more and more of it, and any increases in population will only exacerbate that. Which is interesting when you consider that towns throughout the state have municipal plans and strategic documents that all reference the value of forest land. But those same towns have very limited strategies for addressing maintenance of that forest land. People like it, people value it. It's given as a reason for why they live here. It's referenced in their town plans as being important to the community, and yet they are woefully lacking in any kind of strategies for planning based on forest land. I would like to spend a few minutes quickly moving through kind of a summary of these values of forests. Deputy Secretary Martin did a nice job of summarizing my summary. And to revisit that, there are enormous values that accrue to society just from having forest land. And then when you consider our interactions with that forest land, those values become astronomical. So where are they? We summarize them this way. I'll start with this one. It's really significant in Vermont. The forest products economy, or what we call the forest economy. $1.5 billion nearly in economic output annually to Vermont's economy. That's a significant driver. What's the GDP of Vermont? Roughly speaking, a 25 billion, 1.5 billion directly from forest products. Over 10,000 people employed in the related sectors of that economy, of that forest economy, and 8% of the state's manufacturing value. Not insignificant at all in this forest economy. And it's the first place, or another place I'll remind you that when you have a look at the full document, which we will release on our website later as an electronic version, you'll see there's far more data about the economic impact of Vermont's forests. I just want to capture it here quickly and summarize it and move along. We also have a very significant economy of scenery, tourism, fall foliage, and outdoor recreation. So the forests are this backdrop to our really important tourism economy. They're the natural infrastructure for our world-class outdoor recreation economy. Fall foliage alone is a significant driver of our economy. It's not happening without healthy, intact forests. So forest products, the economics of tourism and outdoor recreation, significant contributions through this part of the sector, related to what that forest products economy is doing. That working forest has its own economic input to our economy, but it's also supplying the basis for these other economic drivers, compounding the value of forests to our society. Now we get into what are often referred to as ecosystem services, the natural infrastructure. This is the role that forests play, the significant, well-documented role that forests play in flood protection, clean water supply, and clean air. Tempering frequency, intensity, and extent of flooding, lowering peak flows and volume of runoff, filtering impurities from our water. The cleanest water on the planet flows through northern hardwood forests, like those that dominate Vermont. That is an unbelievably good deal for us, because it otherwise would be very expensive to treat and clean that water. I would like to say, acknowledging the fantastic attention that's being paid currently to the health and quality of Lake Champlain and all the waters of the state, we have no prayer of cleaning up those waters without a healthy, intact forest ecosystem surrounding it. It's not possible. These forests also play a similar role in our atmosphere, scrubbing the air of pollutants, particulates, and pollutants of all kinds. And again, we're emphasizing, we tend to take this for granted, but these are services that we're not paying for, but we would have to pay for otherwise. That forests reduce the need for costly infrastructure to clean our air and clean our water. It's a really good deal. Of course, forests are habitat. They are home to wildlife and an enormous array of biological diversity. And remember, biological diversity is not just the number of species or number of individuals. It includes everything from the genetic level to the landscape level, all the variations of life forms and how they interact. This is incredibly valuable in its own right, and I think most Vermonters sense that. But providing food, cover, shelter, shading and cooling efforts to temper moisture fluctuations, space to access food, breeding areas, and safe travel pathways. This forest habitat is providing for an enormous array of natural diversity. More and more recently, we understand the role of forests in the carbon cycle, the global carbon cycle. Through their magic of photosynthesis, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, turn it into tree parts that then become tables and floors and food for animals, and they give off oxygen. That's another pretty good deal. Forests remove and store massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. 8 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year, which is about equal to our emissions. So we're kind of hanging tough here relative to our sort of carbon footprint owing to our forests. This has been valued at $16 million in air pollution control and carbon sequestration. Again, a vital service that these private landowners are providing without any compensation. I would argue that our forests are also directly linked to our Vermont brand, our quality of life, and indeed even to human health and our cultural heritage. Repeated studies, peer-reviewed studies, talk about the role of forests, trees in particular and forests in general, improving mood, blood pressure, and immune system health. Incredible. We all know we depend on this quality of life. It's attractive, and many of us are here because of it. It can be directly attributed to intact, healthy forests. Again, we know about this importance for our working landscape, the heritage of our working landscape, people working closely and intelligently with the land, and all that, our history and traditions about outdoor recreation. It kind of defines us. I'd like to focus a little bit on a particular value. This section is just kind of an overview of the values that forests bring to us. Focusing a little bit on a particular value, and that is what we refer to as forest blocks, areas of intact contiguous forest. Many of them are large, but they don't have to be large to have important contributory value. So we refer to them as forest blocks, often spanning multiple ownerships, right? Not just one parcel to another, including multiple parcels. Unfragmented by roads, development, or agriculture, Vermont's forest blocks are primarily forest, but it's important to understand that they also include wetlands, rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, cliffs, and rock outcrops. They're diverse landforms dominated by forest. So we want to call special attention to the power of these areas of forest blocks. Some exceptionally good work by our colleagues in the Fish and Wildlife Department have identified and mapped a range of forest blocks that range from really small pieces to expanses, and using a set of 11 criteria about the qualities, the characteristics of those forest areas, have ranked them. And so we now have a very good handle on where the forests are, how they're configured, their nature, and it helps us to understand and inform our choices about how to manage them and how to consider land use planning over time. So given all those values, that range of economic and ecologic services and forest block values, it's not a surprise that repeated surveys of Vermonters indicate that people like this stuff. They've actually valued it. Even if we don't pay for it or particularly plan for it, it is valued by Vermonters. 97% say they value the working landscape and heritage. 94% say they're proud of living in Vermont. That Vermont's spirit of independence, the value of privacy. These are high-ranking values among Vermonters. And I think it says a lot about what we're working with here. Those values, all of them, depend on forest health and integrity. This is a premise. This is our fundamental working premise at the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. We say forest health first. And that's why we track it, we try to teach about it, we try to encourage people to protect it, because we don't have those values accruing to society without healthy forests and intact forests. Health is this idea of resiliency, that forests can recover. They've shown this remarkable resiliency over time. Our concern here is that, well, it's just kind of logical. How many times can you realistically expect to go to that well and without replenishing it? Can we continue to remove forests like we did in a massive way in the past centuries and expect they would come back? Maybe. I'm not sure, given those values, that it's worth just rolling the dice. And will they come back as healthy and providing those full range of benefits and values? Forest integrity is kind of the opposite of fragmentation. And integrity, I think, again, brings this notion of thinking of forests as a verb, not a noun. That they're intact, they're a physical place, but they're changing, and it's about the processes, the things that are going on within those forests, for humans, animals, and plants. So our point here is to maintain forest integrity, one way or another, requiring connected forests to facilitate mobility of organisms and grow capacity to maintain forest health. That's our operating premise. Which brings us to the topic, really, fragmentation. I was asked to develop a report on what is fragmentation, its current status and projected trends, and then to discuss some options for how we might sustain integrity and prevent further fragmentation. We are indeed very lucky. Highly forested, we're largely in very good condition. And we have this settlement pattern that we're proud of. Compact village centers, agriculture, and it's surrounded by a larger forest matrix. Okay? We're hoping to keep it that way, but we know there are some pressures. Here's where we're going to get into a little detail. I want to share with you some basic terminology. This is an intact, unbroken forest. Okay? We know now that it's a community that's diverse, it's changing, but it's an intact forest. When we refer to parcelization, which is one of the fundamental concepts here, that's just the idea of the legal process of drawing lines on a map, determining ownership. It's still an intact forest, just lines on a map. But those lines on a map are the first piece in this cascade of effects. Because what comes next is perforations in the forest canopy, built infrastructure, and we go from intact to parcelized and fragmented. That's the fragmented forest. And the point here is that when you have large areas of fragmented forest, which is okay, it's people need a place, people habitat too. But we're saying, recognize that this is no longer forest. It's not functioning as forest. It cannot possibly contribute those values that we're concerned with, that we value, the benefits that we value. Okay? So that's parcelization and fragmentation. Parcelization, again, from one owner, a few hundred acres of forest, to multiple owners of smaller areas. And we've seen this repeatedly over time, just a series of slides showing a couple of ownerships in the 50s, becoming a few more in the 60s, same land area, just parcelized, all the way into the 1990s where it's completely parcelized. And this is happening, has happened repeatedly and continues to happen throughout Vermont. The point here is that then that leads to fragmentation. And what does that mean? And how should we plan for it? A couple of slides just to show what we mean by fragmentation, to further refine it. This is an image in the town of Essex in 1966, followed by an image of the same area in 2003, where you see the landscape here, unbroken forest, people working it, people using it, people even living in and around it, but then built infrastructure, largely with roads, followed by other human development. That's a fragmented forest. The point here is that we need to recognize that it's not going to be able to contribute what it once did, and we need to decide whether we're good with that or not, and if not, how to accommodate human use, human development, economic development in a way that supports forest health, integrity, and the values that follow. Another illustration, unbroken forest, one road, a couple of houses. Over time, those expand with built infrastructure, and we're left with, really, a broken forest. And that's what fragmentation is. It's the breaking of forests into smaller pieces. It begins usually with linear infrastructure, followed by built infrastructure, and then a changed land use, so that there's a radiating effect from all of these into the forest. So the effect of this built landscape extends into the forest well beyond just the footprint of those homes and yards. So that's why we talk about forests in terms of core forests that then can be perforated with an opening. Those openings then have that radiating effect, and you need to go several hundred feet away. Those effects are known to extend, the effect on degraded habitat and water quality, etc., extend several hundred feet away from each built footprint. Those are known as edge effects, where it starts to erode the quality, the suitability of that forest habitat. And eventually, when it goes to its extreme, we're left with a highly fragmented landscape of patches of forest remaining. So what drives parcelization and fragmentation? If we're going to think about how to plan, given that this is happening and will happen, and we need to accommodate human use, make places to live and work, transportation, but we need to understand the process so we can think intelligently about how to react. So we've been looking at what we think of as the drivers, the mechanisms of drivers. And we've summarized them here, but they're in further detail in the report. Really, it's related to some escalating property values and land prices. Vermont's a beautiful place and people want to live here. We have this high quality of life. Increased property taxes, conveyance of land from aging landowners without succession planning, and then this concept of exurbanization, sort of rural sprawl, if you will. Those are known and documented as the key drivers of parcelization and then fragmentation. So these mechanisms, again, it's about installation of linear infrastructure, the continued and expanded development that follows, and then really the key is conversion of forest to non-forest and the uses that are associated with them. A couple of examples of Vermont landscapes. This is Killington Bridgewater area, less fragmented forest in a rural place. They have some policies in place, allowing roads and people to build, but somehow still maintaining unbroken forest, contributing those values. In one part of the state, in Heartland area, no local zoning to address forest, lots of roads, rural roads with more and more dispersed development along them, and sadly, highly degraded habitat and forest health conditions. A key fundamental here in talking about how forest landscapes operate and value, particularly for wildlife and biodiversity, is the notion of connectivity. Here we have a forest, a riparian forest along a stream with some patch forests nearby, but still maintaining some corridor of forest to maintain the connections. And this gets back to the idea of the verb, that there's processes that we need to allow to happen. Because if you get to the point where it's highly fragmented, then there's gaps, separations, you lose the connectedness or connectivity among the different pieces of forest that remain. Doesn't have to be all forest. You can have core forest here and core forest there, but as long as you have fragments even and remnants and patches that connect them, you're holding it all together. And that's where some hope lies, that we can, and that habitat, that forest habitat block map I showed earlier is a helpful tool for us to understand. Where are they, what are the linkages, and how can we plan for both? Again, core forest, fragmented landscape, but maintaining some connections. That's the key here. Keep some forest, keep some connections among the pieces of forest that remain. Driving around Vermont, you know, I'm faced with this constantly as I've worked on this project. Relax, Snyder, there's trees everywhere, right? Especially when you kind of drive the transportation network. And it's true, and don't deny it. And it looks great from the road. But what about from above? Same place, right? That's the road you're driving in. That's a highly fragmented forest area. Nobody's cutting any wood. Nobody's, there are no wide-ranging animals living and breeding here. This is a fragmented forest with reduced value. We just need to make some of those choices, but I think we need to be honest about what it is, right? And not be fooled by, well, there's this canopy of trees around us and I think everything's just fine. We need to look a little bit beyond the trees to see the forest. It's not just that was happened to be in Stowe. It's not just relegated to northern Vermont or ski towns. It exists throughout Vermont. A couple of examples in Jamaica in 2000. Notice unbroken forest, the built infrastructure. Okay, but where does it go from there? Just 3 years later, this can happen very quickly. Now we've got linear roads, built infrastructure, and it starts to expand, and now we would suggest that this entire area has been compromised with respect to those values. Nice place to live, I'm sure. Again, just to kind of focus what we're talking about, all of forest fragmentation, we think about the impacts of fragmentation on these forest health, integrity, and the values that come from forest. They really come down to two things. All of the effects of fragmentation stem from two basic mechanisms. One is the so-called edge effect. That's the idea of the edge of forest against non-forest kind of starts to erode the quality of the interior forest as you lose interior forest. So there's edge effects, and there are many, and it has significant implications for many life forms. And then there's the second mechanism is the isolation effect. That's this notion that you have patches of remnant forest separated from other forests. All of the effects that we track can be attributed to these two main pieces, edge effects and isolation effects. So the impacts and effects, we spend a fair amount of time in the report discussing. Summarized here, they really follow the values that we've established with forests previously. So loss of biodiversity, reduced water quality, impacts to wildlife, reducing natural infrastructure and resilience, ecosystem services, increased incidence of invasive plants, pests, and pathogens. To the extreme, we kind of squeeze the forest out to build infrastructure. So we established those values in broad categories, beginning with the forest products economy. So there are impacts of forest fragmentation on those values. Simply put, practicing forestry becomes operationally impractical, economically non-viable, and I would argue culturally unacceptable in heavily fragmented forest landscapes. And this threatens the continued flow of forest goods, that $1.5 billion of the forest products economy, and the services that we depend on. Remember, we use a lot of wood, we make a lot from it, and we are completely dependent on those 88,000 private landowners that dominate the ownership pattern of Vermont for that continued supply of wood products, in addition to the other services. So the forest products economy, in many ways, and we explore this further in the report, summarized here, is a direct impact of fragmentation. Those values related to scenery, fall foliage, tourism, and recreation, a fragmented landscape cannot provide those. Degraded recreational experience, increased likelihood of land use conflicts, we're seeing this more and more, and then significantly decline in public access to private lands, and a loss of that rural culture of spending time on the land for all forms of forest-based recreation, including hunting and fishing. I hope you'll pay serious attention to this one. Fragmentation has severe implications for clean water and flood resilience. I've said earlier about the value of forests for water quality. I won't belabor it here. We spent some time in the report detailing it. I hope you can understand that these are significant impacts of fragmentation. We lose that water quality protection. We lose flood resilience. As I've said, try cleaning up Lake Champlain or any other lake without this forest backdrop. And I would submit to you that as bad as Tropical Storm Irene was, it would have been much worse had we not been forest strong. Vermont is forest strong. That's the point. We need to protect that strength. The values that forests contribute for clean air and climate mitigation clearly would be impacted by fragmentation. We reduce those values. Reduce capacity to absorb carbon, reduce capacity to clean the air. Significant impacts, particularly with roads and other built infrastructure in a fragmented forest landscape, clearly impacts to wildlife and biodiversity. These are all about us, largely about economics, and that's really important. I think it's okay to acknowledge that it's not all about us, and there are concerns about the impacts of fragmentation on the other life forms we share this place with. And I think, importantly, coming back to us, we have a culture, a history of being of the land and with the land. And it's threatened by fragmentation. And the benefits of human health, family connectedness, understanding environment, those are all threatened when we kind of erode the fabric of this forested landscape. I would suggest to you that the future of our forests is in question. I think it's important to realize if you don't care about forests that given their values to us, we probably ought to think about that. We like to say that livable communities, functioning natural systems, and quality of life really do rely on maintaining blocks of contiguous forests across Vermont's landscape. Healthy, intact, functioning forests. So the idea is that we're making decisions every day about land use, the fate of our land. And we need to consider these other realities and be smart about how we approach it from here. So we have in the report listed some more details on some policy options. People have been looking at it. It's not new. And elsewhere, things have fallen apart, and folks are kind of trying to react to it. We've culled the literature, we've talked with experts, we've kind of tried to amass what's the range of options from, you know, soft things like education and outreach that can be very important and helpful to help people understand what the values are, what's at stake, and what are the best tools and strategies for dealing with it. Land conservation, that's acquisition and protection of lands, key strategic acquisition, remains a piece of the toolkit we would suggest. Encouraging landowners to value their lands and work with their lands, give them reasons to keep that land intact and benefit from it. New strategies and tools for land use planning locally and statewide. And then attention to sustainable forestry and support for the forest economy. That kind of is an engine that allows landowners to generate income, say, from their land, keeping forest. It's somewhat counterintuitive that we're going to save forests by cutting trees, and I acknowledge that. But I would ask you to consider that it's real, that if we do it right, we can save forests by having a healthy forest economy and good sustainable forestry practices that protect the health of the land. Use the land to keep the land in forest. So this is an overview of the categories and policy options that we've included in the report, and there are details there for you to consider. They range from education and outreach, strengthening our county forestry program, providing technical assistance to these many landowners. The Forest Roundtable convenes all interested parties, has for several years, hosted and convened by the Vermont Natural Resources Council, have contributed mightily to our understanding of forests, the role of forestry, and the threat of fragmentation. We want to build on this network of existing outreach and service providers. We want to reach landowners. I think it's very important to reach the next generation of landowners and instill an understanding of the value and importance of forests. Looking to support the forest economy with technical assistance through the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program has been an exciting new development, supporting all of the above. The Staying Connected Initiative, which is about understanding the value of these blocks of forest and the connections among them, engaging lots of different partner organizations and individuals. That's really strong. And also, we really lack tools for tracking forest land use. I've showed you some sort of anecdotal pictures, but with emerging remote sensing technologies, use of LiDAR, etc., we can have more quantitative approaches to tracking forest change on the landscape over time. And that would be really important to help us engage with landowners, policymakers, planners at all levels. And we would seek to support those kind of developments. An enhanced forest conservation is in order. We've had a remarkable history of land conservation, acquisition, and protection in this state. And I think now what we're talking about is thinking even more strategically about what additional conservation we would do, where, how, to continue those blocks and the connections among them. We want to be strategic about, with the limited resources remaining, can't just lock it all up. So let's think carefully and strategically about how to continue this incredible history of land protection in Vermont. We also want to start focusing on this concept of intergenerational transfer. Most of the land's owned by private folks. Most of them are older, and they do not have plans. And so there's taxation issues when the land transfers. Many times there are children who live away. There are many of them. All of those things conspire to force landowners to subdivide and carve off a piece. So each kid can get a little piece of the estate. That's good for each of them, but it's not so good for the forest. It's a driver of fragmentation. So giving folks tools to plan for estate planning and succession planning would be a helpful key here. And we've noticed this elsewhere. We're eager to work on that. Again, strategically, let's focus on parcels that are located or adjacent to existing conserved lands, rank high in forest block assessment, those values and attributes I spoke of earlier, that meet Forest Service Working Forest legacy goals. The Federal Forest Service has a forest legacy program for land conservation. We want to have goals and we want to be consistent with those. We think it's smart to focus on conserving parcels that provide important climate adaptation and regional connectivity functions, and those that provide a high level of ecosystem services. Again, let's just really focus on getting the most bang for our conservation buck. We know that the Use Value Appraisal Program, current use, has been enormously important and successful in maintaining forests, working forests, We need to maintain it, strengthen it, continue it. It's one of our best tools we have. Again, focus on state taxes and provide succession planning. And then maybe we could even continue this thought of monetizing those values that have no monetary value to this point. Monetizing ecosystem services. New developments in carbon sequestration, valuing it, providing payments to landowners for that value. And there's work going on now to continue and look beyond that, to give landowners further incentives and maybe economic incentives for maintaining forest land in a healthy, intact condition. Certainly we need to pay attention to land use planning. We want to develop planning tools and strategies at all levels. It's important to look at Section 248, energy siting, etc., for a forest fragmentation consideration. Act 250 has existing criteria. Forests are not part of it. They're just not. Forest soils, 9C, sure. But we consider values when we make land use planning decisions. But we don't consider the value of forests anywhere in this land use planning scheme. And we think it's time to actually do that. More on that in a minute. We also want to continue, as I said, this support for the forest economy, ensuring that landowners can get some economic value from working with their land. Keeping forest by working with forests. Support for the forest products economy. This means we need to focus on a viable workforce. We have an aging population of professional loggers. It's dangerous, it's difficult, it's expensive. Significant love for farmers in this state, and that's really good. Not so much for loggers. And we need to rethink that culture and support the logging community. None of this is happening without them. We also need to focus on markets and marketing, expanding markets for Vermont forest products, in-state and out-of-state. Understanding that timber in particular is a globalized marketplace. We're very small, there are many pressures. We need to be more creative about how we market and brand and use Vermont wood products. Provide more power to the landowners that support the working force. I would call attention to support for the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative. This is the whole concept of the Working Lands Initiative, is to think strategically about the ag and forest economies, where the leverage points are for investment that have this return, that sustain these values. We think that's a good thing, and we want to continue it. When we consider this forest economy, I guess I want to show you this. I don't want to scare anybody away, because we need it all in on this too, protecting forests. But the forest products economy is incredibly complicated and not well understood. I borrowed this slide from the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, and I appreciate it because I think it does a great job of confusing the heck out of everybody. And that's what we're dealing with. We do not have a robust forest economy system. It's all kind of pieced together, and now we have emerging uses of wood for energy. It's not been planned according to the existing systems. And so, through the Working Lands Enterprise Board, we have funded a forest economy systems analysis. I don't control the timing. That report is due later this summer. It's exceptionally good work trying to make sense of all of these connections and the value chains within the forest economy. And I look forward to that forming a basis for providing a guide for strategic investment in various pieces of the forest economy supply chain, but also so that we can, again, limited dollars, invest appropriately where we have the best return. So trying to suss this out and understand how it works. We made really one recommendation. We list several options for policy development. And we really conclude with one recommendation, which is that we need to continue. We've looked at this in something of an academic way, collecting information, organizing it, putting it for your consideration, and we would submit, it's time to now look at those options with a full-blown stakeholder process to take it to the next level. To look at these options, consider additional ones that we haven't thought of, and then come back with some actual plans for what are the policy changes that are needed, locally, regionally, statewide, to protect forest health and integrity. No good forest presentation could really happen without a quote from Aldo Leopold, the father of conservation in this country, and a mentor and an inspiration to many. This is one of my favorite of his quotes. To keep every cog in a wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And that's what I'm going to conclude with here, is that that's what I'm talking about. You might say, what's this about? What do they want? This is not about closing the borders. This is not about stopping human development. This is about intelligent tinkering. We have to tinker. I expect there's going to be more of us. They're not making any more Vermont, but they are making more people every day. And I suspect over time, more and more of them are going to want to be here. And so we're going to have to figure this out if we want to maintain. We are too small to lose these values, and then we have really nothing. We're just too small. And I just think it's fundamentally important for us to understand these values and get it right. So this is about intelligent tinkering. With that, I want to finish with one little piece. I was at a forest conference recently, and I actually met the great-grandson of Aldo Leopold. We had a fantastic conversation. And he shared with me some unpublished notes from Leopold from 1944. These were unpublished notes in a notebook. His great-grandson shared this with me. The meaning of conservation, 1944. He calls for a voluntary decency in land use exercised by every citizen. A voluntary decency in land use exercised by every citizen. Out of a sense of love. He's not afraid to use the word love. Out of a sense of love and obligation to that greater biota we call America. This is the meaning of conservation. There must be some force behind conservation. More universal than profit, less awkward than government, less ephemeral than sport, something that reaches into all times and all places where people live on land, people on land. Something that brackets everything from rivers to raindrops, from whales to hummingbirds, from land estates to window boxes. I don't know how we get on time.
I think you did wonderfully well on time.
Right.
I understand that some of the Senate committees may have to leave us, but if you could join us up here and we maybe get out. If there, and maybe some questions from committee members who are here would be good to address at the time.
I'm happy to try to address them as best I can.
Commissioner, forest fragmentation, of course, is a concern of all of us. And during your presentation, you did mention state, local, county, state policies. And renewable energy has been a big push here to develop renewable energies. And I know in one part of the state that I represent, renewable energy was supported and endorsed and promoted by the state to basically strip off one of our main pristine mountain ridgelines to do this. So my question is, I guess, would you be willing to help out on the siting of renewable energy so this doesn't continue to happen into the future?
Mike, just so it's easier on your voice, a presentation like that on no strings, just use the mic so you can speak quiet and everybody can hear you.
I work on it. In a word, yes. I would, of course. This matters. This is our mandate. This is an important mission, and we want to get it right, as I've said. With respect to renewable energy, siting on forest ridgelines, for example, in the case of the Lowell project, I think maybe you're looking at, the Public Service Board found that there's no denying it's a fragmenting feature, and we have to accept that. It was thought to be I'm not sure this is a word, mitigatable, and we know that, how that works. So, you know, I just need to be straight about it. To me, it is a good example of the challenge of trying to balance all these values, and I've tried to convey here enormous value and benefit, but also a need to, you know, live, work, provide energy, and it's a great example of the struggle of getting that right.
Like the forest was when it was reforested in the 1900s, early 1900s, did that just regenerate, or was there any management of that?
So we have benefited from, and we continue to benefit from what we call natural regeneration. Our silvicultural practices here are based on that. These are the techniques we use to manage forests carefully, whereas in the southeast and the northwest, it's based on, you know, in a simple way, clear cutting and replanting. We cut differently, generally, and try to rely on seedlings. We try to manipulate the forest conditions, the ground conditions, the moisture, the light, to provide a favorable environment for natural regeneration. And that's how it happened then. It was just, that's the remarkable resilience, is when it was cut over heavily and used, converted to agriculture, when that farm abandonment happened, well, trees happened. And we've been blessed and lucky, and we expect that that could happen again. We just don't know how many times and what form. Natural disturbance in the normal range, the historic range of disturbance patterns, so that we can kind of, we don't mimic it, but we try to emulate those patterns so that we have natural regeneration.
Yes, and then,
This is where it gets awkward. I'm sitting directly behind you.
Sorry.
There are, you mentioned, you know, competing pressures, and one of them in Vermont, I think, as far as our settlement pattern goes, that is pressure against the densely settled village center is such a huge and water. And, you know, my town without a public septic, we cannot inbuild the town when rivers disappear. And so we build outside of town. And I think that the 10-acre exemption is probably a huge driving factor in settlement patterns, an unintended consequence of creating the parcelization of land. Can you address that?
Well, I can't address it in any sort of final way or conclusive way. It's certainly not my area of expertise. I think you're right. I think this is an enormous challenge and difficulty, and that's the kind of example of how complicated this is, and that why we need, to borrow the phrase of the day, all in on this. And I need to work with our colleagues in our plant legal and planning offices, and our colleagues outside of government in planners and developers as well, engineers. I mean, I think there's some hope in new technologies, but it's complicated. I just don't know how to say, well, here's the answer to that one. I think it's another example of how challenging this is, and we need to think about it critically and strategically and use all those tactics. I'm sorry I don't have a better response. It's not my area of expertise, but I acknowledge that it's a challenge and that it's part of getting those kind of pieces right will go a long way in giving us a little bit more flexibility on the landscape.
So, Michael and Room. Room know that Michael did a presentation a couple, maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago, the Green Mountain Club, the NRC Sierra Club, about this topic, not this presentation. And Michael, at that presentation, you dipped back into history as you did here. Vermont's forests had been depleted to 20% and then had recovered to some amazing, my memory was 78 or 80%. But what you didn't say today is, where is it headed now? Is it static, or has it changed from that percentage to going the other way? Can you share that with us?
Thank you. Yeah, and again, another example that this is an overview. The report goes into further detail about the current status and projected trends. our understanding from federal partners that help us track the extent and nature and condition of Vermont's forests, that for the first time in 100 years, we're actually turning the other way. Our forests we've been practicing forestry in a very low stakes environment, and a grading forest. It has been expanding for decades in area and in age and size, and for the first time in 100 years, that's stopping, and it's actually turning at a tipping point where we actually start to see loss of forest land. While we still are largely forested, that's kind of the whole point, is acting now. You know that actions now have repercussions down the road, and so we want to stem that. I don't know that we have to have no further change to the forest, extent the area of the extent of the forest, but we want to be aware of it and make sure that we're keeping the right pieces. So to answer the question, yes, for the first time in about a century, we're seeing forest loss. So to answer the question, yes, for the first time in about a century, we're seeing forest loss in a general way across the state. Oh, yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you. Kind of piggybacking off that exchange too. I guess the conflict balance I see as well, though, is the reality. I would assume that we can all agree upon is we all are contributors or at least beneficiaries of fragmentation. Think of all the communities that we all live in now have been fragmented, and I think one of probably the largest case in point you can see if we would have had a picture of the Greater Burlington area, some century or more ago, then and now, it's a whole different landscape. And so I guess my question is then, how do we have the proper balance of saying like other communities that because again, being on the other side, I hear about the driving economic force that we're saying is the Burlington area that's highly fragmented. For other communities that are needing industry to pick up and other things, to have that proper balance and to allow so responsible growth, but the opportunity for a business to come in, and which might require then putting up a factory somewhere. Can you speak on again? Basically, how do we, again, so allow wise fragmentation, but then at the same point, not depriving, growth in other sectors of our state?
Yes. I hope you've heard me. I'm genuine when I say we, us. This is not pointing fingers or saying this part has it right and those people don't. So I take that seriously, and I think that's why we're saying, let's establish the importance, let's be realistic about the threats and vulnerabilities, and let's together think about how we're going to sort that out. And it is about balance and some tough choices so that we can meet all these needs. That's what I look forward to, is further dialogue like that. How do we accommodate those things? And to me, it's simply asking that we add this as a lens. We just say, you know what, this is really fundamentally important. It's important for everybody, particularly important for Vermont, because we're so tied to it that we need to think about how do we meet those needs while protecting these values.
Dave?
Commissioner, thank you for the awesome presentation. I would like you to speak to the part that current use has played in forestry.
Certainly. Make reference to it again, more details in the report, but about half, just under half of all the eligible forest land in Vermont is enrolled in the forestry portion of the current use program. 1.8 million acres and 15,000 parcels, and they are contributing mightily. It provides fair tax for folks who keep their land in agricultural and forest use. The forestry side, which is our purview, our county foresters administer that. It comes with some strings attached. Significant reduction in your property taxes because you're committing to maintaining that land as working forest according to a written forest plan, according to standards that are approved by the county foresters with inspection. And this has been enormously helpful to all of the values we're talking about, including serving as kind of a local economic engine. keeping people working on it. I used to be a county forester. I worked with many landowners for many years, and folks would say, tell me about this program where I can save on my taxes. Now, I love my land, and they'd say, I want to enroll, I want to basically enroll the land and just protect it from the animals, and that's wonderful. But I would say to them, that's wonderful. It just doesn't happen to meet the qualifications of the program. To be in the program, you can't just draw a line around your land and leave it alone. You can draw a line around your land and have a sane plan for working with it, thus putting foresters, loggers, truckers to work, supplying local mills, making local wood products, providing energy wood for schools. More than a third of Vermont school children go to schools heated by wood, procured locally, according to sustainable forest practices. That's what the current use program has done. We need to understand when we talk about costs of the program that there are. That's fine. I'm a numbers guy, and I like looking at those things. I just think fairly you have to also look at those benefits, and they're real, significant, and wide-ranging. Much benefit has accrued because of the current use program.
John.
Michael, I'd like to thank you for one thing you pointed out, and pointed out again in case some of the folks in this room missed it. I'm one of the few guys that has a skidder and a big collection of chainsaws and loves getting out in the woods. But the value of the professionals that are doing that work, and oftentimes we in this building talk about the work in landscape, and everybody loves the work in landscape until the skidder and the chainsaw starts up and people start complaining about the noise. And we've got a lot of really good professionals in the forest industry, and Michael's absolutely right. Without cutting the trees, we can't save the forest. And I think a lot of times in this building, that group gets overlooked and by some people, sort of vilified when there are a lot of them out there doing great work and really saving the forest.
Well, I appreciate that comment, and I think it does merit underscoring. I'm glad you heard me say it. And I'll say it again, I think it's absolutely important. We're not holding this together without them, but it's a tough way to go, and it needs support. We need to consider the costs and the dangers, the sort of social license. And the only thing I would add, I don't want to end it on a bummer, but just to acknowledge that, there are some, like in any field, there's some bad actors, and we need to be serious about raising the bar of accountability there, giving landowners recourse. And I think that's an important piece of also supporting the many, many professional, talented, dedicated forest workers.
Alice.
Commissioners, as we know, the maple industry continues to grow exponentially, also under vacuum lines on our trees. And I'm just wondering what you see maple industry playing as a role in the pros and cons that come along with this industry as it continues to pick up.
It's a great question, really important. You're right, there's real change there. Maple and maple sugaring, really important traditions in the state. They're not just warm and fuzzy traditions. They include, buckets in the backyard and all this. We are seeing an industrialization, if you will. I think it bears watching. I grew up sugaring. As a forester, I worked with many sugar makers. They're among the best days I've ever had. And I think a couple things to point out. We acknowledge that maple syrup is an agricultural commodity, but we consider sap to be a forest product, and that you can't have sustainable sugaring without sustainable forestry. And even if all you care about is sap, volume, sweetness, and sugar, maple syrup quality, it's important to protect forest health. And that's our take, and we're going to stick to it. So we have released new guidance and standards for sugars in the current use forestry program that need to avoid monocultures, to promote understory regeneration of the future forest, to protect forest health, to use proper tapping guidelines, etc. We think that's good information and helpful, and it's supporting maple syrup. It's not an obstacle. It's in their best interest in the long run. You mentioned tubing and other infrastructure. That's also of interest. I think it's new. We have questions and concerns about the impacts on wildlife and on the recreating public. And I think there's some growing pains here, and it's worth looking at, and we'll continue to do so.
If I could, Al, take questions from members of the legislature first, and then we'll open it up for a few minutes of questions from the public. Other questions from members of the committees? Yeah, Paul.
What factors do you see today in the economy that's both maintaining or fostering the working forest?
I'm not sure.
Basically, how can people make a living on a working forest today? What is trying to push them, allow them to do that, continue to do that?
Well, it's our history and traditions that we're holding on to. I think we have a culture, we had at least, and maybe still have, remnants of a culture of people sort of the land, from the land, understanding that, you can work with it that way. I think we're in danger of losing that, and more people not of the land and from the land. What we're holding on to is some vestiges of an earlier time, and I think that's what the interest of the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative is, the Forest Economy Systems Analysis I referenced, is to look at it, and where do we need to modernize, and where do we need to support and strengthen, and where are the strategic investment points? Because I think it's becoming harder and harder for folks to do, as you asked, make a living from the land. There's just enormous challenges. Wood in particular is heavy. And so moving it around is expensive and fossil fuel consumptive. And so small changes, we saw some drops in fuel prices this winter, and I know loggers that were working 24/7 to take advantage of that, because those fuel prices are so important to their work and to their margin that they had to take advantage of it, and they kept crews going all day and all night, all through the winter. Just as an example, I'm offering that as an example of these small pieces that there are such a thin margin. Every little bit helps. From workers' compensation, which is prohibitively expensive, transportation costs, globalization of the marketplace. We've lost mill capacity, we've lost kiln capacity, kind of that infrastructure that, we're very proud of our understanding of forests and how to guide landowners in managing those forests. We can go out and implement exceptional silvicultural practices and paint the trees and flag the trails and riparian protection zones. None of that matters if there's nobody to do the work and no economy to which to sell those products. And those things are struggling. And so that's what I'm referring to as a support for that economy, because that's the framework that allows folks to continue to work with the land, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to do any of it.
Seeing no other questions immediately, you mentioned quickly at the beginning of your presentation where people can get the report. I was wondering if you could do that again, so if anybody missed where this will be published, that they can get to it.
Thank you for that reminder. And I apologize. I meant to put it on my final slide here. It's the website. So I've made hard copies for some of the committee members, the chairs in particular. We'll send a PDF electronic version of the report to the committee assistants here momentarily, and then we will put a PDF version of the report on our website. vtfpr.org will get you there.
Everybody get that? You want to repeat it?
vtfpr.org.
Okay. And then for committee members, I have a letter that was brought to us by DNRC, but it's a letter supporting the recommendations of this report signed by 60 stakeholders. I want to make sure that maybe I'll give the chairs copies so that you can get to your committee and to your fellow Senate committee. Actually, if we can get it electronically, we'll put it on our committee websites. That would give it some additional exposure also.
When I started off with the questions, I didn't thank Michael for his presentation. Very well done.
Thank you.
Look forward to working with you and trying to correct or reverse our trend. know certainly how important this is to our state and our citizens. And be glad next session, maybe even this summer, we could put together some thoughts and ideas and work with the House committees and get this rolling. Because once it's gone forever.
Thank you, Senator Starr. I appreciate that.
I'd also like to thank you, Michael, and I'd also like to remind folks that you referenced the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative a number of times, and you know, the budget for that is diminished a bit, but it is still in the budget, and we're hoping that it makes it through the process intact, because I think that that is a really valuable tool in terms of getting money out to not only agriculture, but also forest products concerns, and we'd like to maintain that.
Okay, we'll take about 5 minutes for questions from those who have joined us here. Sir.
A number of years ago, the federal government had a big problem with acid rain. Now the elephant in the room is climate change and invasive species coming in. And I'm sure you're all aware of it. And but there are projects that the federal government set up, and I think that Vermont should maybe pay attention to that, like the Hubbard Brook project, and where we can keep track of this and not let it hit us and not be able to do something about it, and keep track of the problems with climate change.
Indeed, we, to begin, you know, acid rain didn't go away. It's still actually influencing the health of our forests. We have additional, you referenced climate change, invasive organisms, invasive plants, outcompeting native regeneration, invasive insects, invasive pathogens. There are mounting threats. I mentioned those early on. We discussed them further in the report, but in addition to just the sort of expanding use of the land, there are these natural threats that are going on whether we're doing anything or not, and they are part of the problem, and we have to address those. We talk about it in the report, understanding fragmentation in the context of climate change, invasive organisms, and air pollution as just ongoing threats to the health and integrity of the forest. All of those things simply complicate an already complicated challenge.
I'm just thinking that there are possibly getting some federal land that you could do something like the Hubbard Brook project in New Hampshire, so that you can keep a good eye on exactly what's happening.
Well, I understand. I appreciate it. I happened to work at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest for 10 years previously in my career in forest science, and understand the role of studying forests and their response to human use and change. We have the Vermont Monitoring Cooperative here in Vermont that's an expansive network of scientists and others doing just that, tracking all aspects of forest health in a measured way, monitoring and compiling data over a really long period of time so we can do just that, kind of track these changes. And it's a really important piece of understanding what's going on, and we certainly support efforts to support that.
Yes, sir.
Yes. A couple of comments. I think one of the rarest corridors we have are our ridge lines because of the very rare plant and animal infrastructure up there. And to blast out 3 miles at a time for whatever project is wrong. And if we can't protect those, we're in big trouble. The other is sugar operations. That was brought up. We have one down in Chittenden, in just north of Rutland, Vermont, Chittenden, town of Chittenden, and there's a little patch of state land that they have to work around, but they have put thousands of man-hours clearing the brush and clearing out trees, headed basically for monoculture for 250,000 taps. This goes right over the ridge line of the Green Mountains, and you folks should go down there and look at that. The difference between where the state land property is and where this operation that goes all the way around it is stunning.
I appreciate that.
Closing thoughts, Commissioner?
Thank you. Yes, I would say thanks for your attention and your consideration, and I'll leave you with one thought, which is I hope you will consider these enormous and wide-ranging values and benefits, and consider that we can't outsource the values and benefits of forests. Thank you.
Thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.